Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Oli Mould. Oli is a British geographer at Royal Holloway, University of London. His research and writing focuses on the role of urban creativity, mutual aid, activism, and politics. In his books Against Creativity and Seven Ethics Against Capitalism, along with his other writings online and in academic journals, he denounces contemporary creativity and neoliberalism and proposes new political for a fairer, more sustainable, ecologically just, and planetary future. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Oli Mould. Oli is a lecturer at Royal Holloway, University of London, and the author of brilliant and provocative books, which we recently came across as sour and found very thought-provoking, which are Against Creativity, Seven Ethics Against Capitalism, and Urban Subversion and the Creative City. Oli, welcome.
Hi, how you doing?
Good, thank you. We're so happy to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Please tell us a bit about yourself and your background and how you came to write these amazing books.
Well, that's first of all very kind to say that they're amazing. That's you're probably overstating them a bit, but so I guess the background to them came from my career trajectory. Really, I started doing a PhD in human geography, and I was doing it on the cultural industries, on the creative industries as an idea. And it was around 2004, 2005 when the creative industries were becoming quite politically prevalent and very important, particularly in the UK where I was based. They were the brainchild really of Tony Blair's New Labour government. And I won't go into the background of their collectivization, but essentially they were big business really, and they were sort of very, very hot politically. So the creative industries were a real big thing, and I finished my PhD and got a job as a kind of consultant, it was in a think tank essentially called the Creative Industries Observatory. And it was sort of initially started and it kind of sold as it would be an academic engine where you do some really cool data gathering and questionnaires and really sort of hard and fast academic studies. And that would then inform other institutions around it, which would then go on and advocate for the creative industries abroad and that sort of thing. But very quickly, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months into the job, it became a bit more of a sort of lobbying exercise, and it became very quickly mired in all of the various political problems that these things get associated with. And I spent a lot of time over in Westminster in Treasury select committees and all sorts of boring things that were essentially just advocating for sort of British businesses, and the language was very superficial, and I just got very, very upset and very, very disillusioned with it all. So I decided to scurry back into academic life with my tail firmly between my legs, and I embarked upon a sort of more traditional academic route. But that disillusionment, if you like, with the creative industries never left me, and it kind of became part of the academic work which I then pursued. And it culminated in the first two books, which is obviously Urban Subversion and the Creative City, and then Against Creativity, and they're both very much critiques of how creativity is mobilized politically, economically, socially. Obviously the first one being sort of more urban focused, but then the Against Creativity being more kind of just how it is more socio-politically, I guess. So that's really the background. That's kind of where they all came from. And then I've kind of gradually more angry at the world since. So it's that's kind of where my disdain, if you like, for the creativity discourse comes from.
Oh, I love it so much. And we don't necessarily perceive it as like anger. I mean, we're called sour, right? Like our podcast is
Well,
called with What's Wrong with. Clearly, we have an attitude, but we love the attitude in the books. And obviously, like when we really advocate for like creative approaches, like a title like Against Creativity was very, very intriguing
yeah.
for us. And then also, like, even though, like, being in the industry and observing many dysfunctionalities during practice, it still was, at least like for me, it was really surprising to, like, I definitely had a lot of, oh, right, like moments when reading, right? It was still like very, it raised my consciousness, let's say, in many things around creativity and maybe, let's say, Western creativity, or even like in your case, maybe like capitalist creativity. Um, could you give a little bit more, and you build this up like great in your books, but like context of, like, first of all, I guess what could or should creativity mean? Well, we'll come to that later. But like,
Mm.
what is it at present today as widely practiced? Like, what is creativity?
So when you hear the term creativity, it's more often than not a top-down narrative, and that this is the political collectivization, if you like, which I was just mentioning before, because it's an idea which is mobilized or has been mobilized deliberately by political discourses to mean accumulation, growth, and essentially the same kinds of economic practices which have been going on for decades and decades since. So there's different kinds, slightly different stories about, and depending on where you go to, but essentially you can boil it down to the new Labour government, Tony Blair in the United Kingdom. There was a bit before that in Australia actually, but in a Western context, Tony Blair and his Cool Britannia rhetoric, which swept him into power in 1997, 1998. That was the beginning of the creativity discourse. The context around that, you've got the onset of the internet and virtual technologies, and just the sort of spread of global capital around the world. The ability to do work all around the world, and so there was a sense that what the weightless economy, if we're going to use that word, which often people use at school, don't use it much anymore, but that idea that you can kind of move anywhere and do anything, and the economy is based on ideas and creativity, and so that was really the genesis of the term. And actually, you can trace it back to a guy called Chris Smith, who late one night he was meeting the Treasury the following day in an attempt to try and get a load of money. And he said, why, instead of calling them the cultural industries, so film, TV, radio, the arts, they were before that called the cultural industries. And he said, no, culture is very badly funded. No one likes funding culture in today's world. Let's call them the creative industries. And really, that was it. And after that, they're like, oh yeah, how can you be against creativity? So they called it the creative industries, and it was really as he's told me, a finger in the wind exercise. It was like, well, let's just sort of do this. And then they wrote this document, they collectivized it, and it's stuck. It's stuck ever since, like 20, 25 years later. So it was a political exercise. And from that, it says, right, well, you have to be creative, you have to be agile, you have to be footloose, you have to do this, you have to do that. But they're all designed they follow the contours of the prevailing kind of ways in which capitalism goes, making people more agile, making sure that they can do more with less. It's all a language designed to keep us ensnared in a realm of work. The classic example I talk about in the book, I think I mentioned it briefly, is Subway, the fast food chain, right? They called their people sandwich artists.
Yeah.
To me, that just sums up really nicely. It's like, well, no, they're fast food workers. They're precarious fast food workers with low pay, and they're called artists. And so there's a real, that you can see where it goes. It's just a sort of superficiality which masks existing processes of extraction, and all that sort of stuff. So that's kind of what creativity is, from a sort of top-down perspective. When you see it everywhere on posters and policy reports, that's what they're referring to.
It definitely made me reflect to, like, language has power, and kind of like starts defining our behaviors and environments, whereas also environments and behaviors like start shaping language. But I like it really like stuck with me, like the conversation around like how also the word creative or creativity is basically, like to your point, is almost used as a euphemism for something that is a little bit more uncomfortable, but like, oh, let's get creative, which like is used in a context where it totally shouldn't. I also feel like one other word like that is like collaboration. We collaborated, right? Like, which you clearly didn't collaborate. Like, I feel like we carry these words around things where like try to, I don't know, we're trying to make ourselves feel better or feel less guilty of what we're doing, whatever the reason is. But like that was super
Yeah.
interesting. And also like to your point about really, I guess like driving economy, like I connected the dots, like knowing, we do work with a lot of creative agencies, and as we work, like we realize, oh wow, like majority of the content of the world is controlled by like several agencies. And you're kind of like, so you could easily like create trends, right? Like you can promote
Mm.
one concept, and then you're like reflecting back in like history, like as a woman too. Oh, like like you can do it all kind of like marketing for like mothers and like really like representing a woman like getting on a flight and then picking up their child from daycare like with seamless hair, right? So like all of that, like it made me reflect on like so many things, um and then you're kind of like, is it creative work or is it then, I don't know, like societal engineering or mass transformation, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
And then I also like reflected on some things like sometimes the creative firms or firms that are trying to be creative also become complicit in it by, I don't know, like maybe making budget as a or timeline as an excuse to not really get creative,
Mm.
right? Although like we believe that creativity actually starts when you have many constraints that are like that
Yeah.
corner you, and you can actually be creative, but creativity somehow is like being associated with like having a large budget so you can like do anything. And then you like the examples you give around like the tech industry and like how like they're very creative, right? And probably get a lot of venture capital money. So I like reflected on so many different aspects, and was curious to like get your thoughts on like, is that also like what you want to like resonate with like readers, or like
Mm.
like or like what is the like what did you also hope for people both in the creative industries and not like think or
Mm.
feel as they're reading?
So I think that there's a real sense that, I didn't want necessarily people to jack in what they're doing and say, "Oh, I'm not going to leave the creative industries," or whatever it is. I think I'm hopefully relatively careful to ascertain that sculptors, computer game designers, advertisers. Well, maybe not advertisers. Different argument altogether. But that being creative or being artistic is not a problem. It's how it is all kind of brought together. So the question I always ask to people is, what is it you're creating? What is it you're actually, trying to create? And when I've asked artists this, and software engineers and computer games, or whoever they end up being, the answer was, it revolves around an emotional response. I want to create an emotional response in someone. So whether they're watching a film or listening to a piece of music or playing a computer game, I created it because I wanted people to have a sort of an emotional response. And that, that is at its heart is kind of what the creativity should or could be. It's that emotional response to a particular problem or to a particular thing in the world, and then you respond to that in some way, and ideally trying to sort of make it a better thing, whatever it ends up being. They never say, "Oh, I wanted to make more money," or "I wanted to sort of bring something," but that's ultimately how the creativity discourse comes about. They're saying, "Oh, we be creative, but only bring something to the market." It's like, "Oh, be creative, make that new computer game so we can make more money. Make that new film so we can get more bums on seats in the cinema." So there's a clash there between what is it you're actually creating, what is it you trying to bring into the world. And I think that's what I was trying to get at, is that the current discourse of creativity doesn't bring anything new to the world. It just brings new stuff that we can consume in the same way. So what I'm trying to get people to think about is like, well, actually, what is it you're trying to create? Are you creating something genuinely new? Is it an emotional response? Is it a brand new way of seeing the world? Is it a brand new form of social organization? So, yeah, I mean, we can talk about some of the other things, but I mean, like, for me, some of the most creative people and creative collectives are those that are bringing genuinely new forms of societal organization into the world. So that's where I wanted people to see it. And actually, some of the best responses I've had to the book have been from people who have been, quite relatively sort of high up, if you like, in the creative industries. And they said, oh, I've never been able to put on the finger of why I feel so bad, but you've been able to do it. And it's been great hearing from these people. And they've gone on to do some really interesting things since.
Because I could see, like, like, for example, if we think about a famous songwriter, right? Let's say Adele. Clearly, like, when she's writing songs, like, it's very personal, pouring from her heart, and then, like, it resonates with millions and potentially, helps them go through their own personal journey while listening to such music, right? So there's definitely, like with your creative work, you're touching others' lives. And it's a new thing into the world. And yet, as you release that, so this is like where it gets like mind-boggling for me, right? So let's say you created something totally out of the system, right? And shared it with the world, and people are now consumers of it. And it's maybe, sometimes we have anthems of, rise against, like, governments. We have breakup songs, like, whatever, right? So they're part of, like, people's personal journeys, or sometimes even society's personal journeys. And yet, that eventually still becomes part of the system. It becomes a product where it starts feeding the industry, or like all the moneymakers start gathering around that artist to sponsor the next hit, which then turns into this like machine again, where I'm sure all artists kind of like go through a crisis in their lives when that starts happening. So with all these complex, overlapping, tangent, parallel systems in the world, how does even creativity live outside or survive outside of these systems? Or do we ever intend to? Or do we recognize it's going to be part of the system, but maybe it will avoid XYZ? So this is like layers of like where it gets like very complex for me. So I wanted to unpack this with you.
It's a really important question, and one that I often engage with when we have these conversations, wherever I might be, whether it's in my lectures with my students, or whether it's in seminars, or indeed, podcasts like this. It's a really important question, and I don't have all the answers, and no one person does, but I think collectively there's an understanding that the subsumption, if you like, or the appropriation of a personal idea, like you say, like one of Adele's songs, or even like perhaps an anti-capitalist motif, right? The classic example, that Pepsi advert with Kyle Jenner when she hands the Pepsi. I mean, things like that. Things get appropriated so quickly these days because capitalism is very, very agile in what it does, and that's why I think the advertising industry is, not creative in any way, shape, or form, because that's purely what they do. So I think that it's, in order for to sort of be outside, in inverted commas, the system, or at least for an idea that does have some resonance in creating a better world, then it's like you say, it's that sort of socio-political machine that spreads it out from that initial sort of person's mind that needs to change. In the last, I guess, 30, 40 years of sort of neoliberal capitalism, it has been that machine has been utterly perfected to take an idea and profit from it immediately, to like slap a label on it, put it into market. what we need to do, I say we need, I think that's a loaded two words there, but I think that in order for these ideas to sort of actually affect change and make lives better for people, is for that machine to be altered. And that's the Against Capitalism book. The subtitle, I think, is really important, towards a planetary commons. So I'm a little bit annoyed that they didn't put on the front of the cover of the book. Perhaps I should, second edition maybe. But I think that that subtitle, towards a planetary commons, is what I think is what needs to happen. And so there are ways in which these systems, these structures, these so political and social structures can be changed. We see it all around us. And actually, with climate catastrophe happening, that those voices are getting louder, saying like, we can't continue on a growth protocol, so like degrowth and things like, you know, common ownership of things, taking out private ownership of things that are really far too important to be given over to public companies, like healthcare, like, you know, water. So there's lots of political maneuverings that can be done. But of course, you've got to have the political appetite to do it. And here in the UK and in the US and various other parts of the Western world, you know, we are lumbered with these governments which don't sort of think that way. So there are options, and there are examples all around us of how these systems can be done on quite big scales, quite national scales, you know, sometimes on urban scales as well. So I'm hopeful, because they do exist, and these systems will allow those creative people, those creative ideas, to actually do what they were meant to do, and, you know, affect change in people's lives, and then they can then go on to affect change in the world more broadly. So yeah, that's kind of the answer. But that, you know, that's a very, very difficult question. It involves political action, it involves resistance, it involves all sorts of different things, but it can be done.
Yeah, I did feel like that book is a little bit like exploring the solutions, right?
Yeah.
And I loved it in a way because, like, you know, like we often come across on whichever what problem or what we're talking about on this podcast, some of the commonalities and like how do we even like find solutions is like, well, one, I guess like big thing that keeps coming up is like diverse collaborations, right? And the other one is like both bottom up and top down solutions. And yet, like for top down, I guess policy often, if not always, lags, right? So we cannot necessarily wait around for
Yeah.
like policy to change. But what I loved about the book is like when you talk about ethics, it can start on an individual level, right? Like, for example, you talk about individualism versus mutualism, and you can be a more empathetic person, an open person, and a caring person about people and strangers around you as an individual. And you, like, it's kind of like that would resonate, right? Like, hoping that that would have a ripple effect, and it could. Um, and, you know, like, it's also like everything that else, like you talk about. And Alfie Cohn, who we also like interviewed on this podcast, talks about like respectful rebellionism. Like that's how we have to raise respectful rebels, like for like future generation, and how to raise kids. And he highly criticizes like all these like stickers of like, you know, spoiled child and all of that, like children who are like acting out where they're actually maybe questioning or going against something, you know, like things that we actually want to see from adults. We kind of curb them when they're little. So he talks about a little bit, like he looks at this angle in like an early childhood, which I really like connected with your book. But can you like walk us through maybe quickly about like the main like themes, like the ethics you talk about in the
Yeah.
book? Because I feel like in itself, like all of us can take note on a personal level in all of those, and really don't feel like this is just like a big problem that we can't do anything about, but there's something to do at an individual level.
Yeah, so there are 7 of these ethics which I outline, and as you say, they're individual traits to a certain degree, but I do try and sort of say how they can be thought about more socially. You know, I guess very quickly, those are the mutualism. So you're thinking about kind of, like you say, being more empathetic, because we are social creatures, right? And I think that if we can make an effort to be more empathetic in our daily lives, that sort of stuff does spread through communities. And there's lots of really excellent examples, particularly during the pandemic, you know, mutual aid and all the various things. You know, it was a horrible time. It still is kind of ongoing, right? I mean, it's a horrible time for many people, but, you know, I saw some fantastic examples of community actions coming together in being very mutual. So there's that one. The other one is kind of being minoritarianism. So I always try to keep them as one word, so it's kind of a bit of a made-up word, but essentially just recognizing that the world as it currently is very unequal, as we know, and there are various sort of identity politics around all that, and there are various identities of people which have more power than others at the moment, simply because of the structures we've built, institutional racism, sexism, ableism, classism, all these things. So it's about understanding that and trying to equalize that as much as you possibly can. Practically, that just involves understanding your privilege and using it for the betterment of others. It sounds like utopian, but that's essentially what it is. The third one is thinking about transmaterialism, and I use the word trans deliberately as a because of its critique of binary thinking, because capitalism is very good at dividing the world into humans and non-humans, and sort of thinking that, well, to be a human is you have to be a good human, you have to grow and consume and buy things and get your mortgage and your 2.4 kids and whereas and it makes things non-human, saying, well, they are therefore to be sacrificed on the altar of profitability. So being transmaterial is to kind of problematize that a little bit. So veganism to a certain extent, although I have my issues with the veganism, but things that sort of help us to understand that the world is part of us and we are part of the world, essentially. And there are other being slow is obvious, like understanding failure, not necessarily as a kind of precursor to success, but failure, understanding it on its own terms. And another one's like decodification, which is quite complicated, and I've had a few talks to some people who don't really necessarily agree with it, to be honest. But the idea that we live in a quantified world, everything has to be given a number. In fact, last night I was just on the train, I was just flicking through Google, and people like 5-star ratings, like the TripAdvisorification of everything. Even things like stations have star ratings. It's like, I don't need to know whether this is a really cool station. I need to use it, right? I don't have a choice. I don't care whether it's got 1 star or 5 stars on Google. The same with things like pharmacies and car parks. People rate these things. It's like, well, why? Why are you doing this? So, like, trying to sort of just step away a bit from a quantification, because there's so much of exists in the tacit qualitative world which gets lost in all that. And then finally, the last one's love. I mean, obviously, that's the kind of inner hippie in me, I guess, coming through. But love is a very powerful force when thought about in particular ways. And so individually, they kind of act as, like you say, personal kinds of, someone called it a self-care book for anti-capitalists, which I guess I call that. But collectively, I think you put them all together, and I think that though you get a little bit of, I hesitate to words, blueprint. I think of it more as a sort of prompt, I guess, for how social and institutional frameworks can be built that actually are better for the world, with climate catastrophe and all that, and also better for us. So that's kind of what that book is about. And so the Against Capitalism, I think that was done to sort of be provocative, but actually it's a slightly more hopeful book than that, I think.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And like we also, I guess to like for the listeners too, to reflect on these like ethics on a corporate level, right? Like, I mean, we're not necessarily corporate, we're like studio of 15 people, but still like there are like takeaways you can do from these and like apply in like processes or practice as well. Like, for example, going into any project, we do kind of like a positionality exercise, right? Like, where do we stand in life? Like, what is our privilege? Who's not in the room? Like, understanding all of that. Like, this is a simple activity that you can do, which I think goes a long way in the process. Or like, we commission ourselves a lot of research, and we purposefully delay any design solutions or concepts or outcomes that we might create out of it, because like, especially like one example was like during the pandemic, right? Like everybody was like, pandemic started, everybody's like rushing around like out like design solutions which are featured in major publications and hideous ideas, right? Like, let's eat in like plastic bubbles from now on, like all of these non-sustainable, not environmentally friendly, not adaptive like things coming out. Like, we purposefully really slowed down and said like, okay, if work life is changing, that also means home life could be changing. So why not we do diary studies at homes, right? Like what is changing? Like actually, like so I think we're living in such a fast pace, we want everything yesterday world that we really forget to slow down. And with that, by not slowing down, we carry a lot of bias and perform a lot of things on autopilot, which is contributing and just manifesting the problems. So I think like these are like some examples that we see. Like, well, I both like as reading, I both felt like, oh, there's something personal I can do about this. But I also felt like, oh, yeah, like there are some things we can still do also at work level, which probably even would have a bigger impact because, especially as creatives or designers, architects, like our outcomes affect other people's lives and kind of define equity or inequity, right? In some ways, in some contexts. So everything that you mentioned in the book has like ways of like engaging into our day-to-day personal and like business processes. And I wanted to just like touch upon this a little bit for the listeners to, for these to not feel like abstract or too big, right? Like you can start somewhere. Like clearly, there's a small action in all of these.
Absolutely, because ultimately that's what the world is made up of, right? They are made up of small actions and everyday, everyday activities, all kind of cobbled into one sort of meta narrative at the end. I mean, that's why I use the term ethics. I won't bore you with the philosophy of it, but essentially it's about contagion. They're ethics because they're contagious.
Love that.
Ultimately, if you do it, act in this way, you might not see it happening around you, but it does. If you don't have to be a CEO or a person with any kind of influence, you could just in your everyday life, you will come across different people, different things, different materials, and if you can sort of have those ideas in your head as you're acting and behaving and just living, then it does sort of via this kind of contagious sort of osmosis, if you like, it does spread through the world, which is why we need more of it. So yeah, it's not about kind of thinking big, although we do have to sort of have those processes in our mind, but we can only act individually, and so that's that tired phrase, isn't it? Think global, act local. I mean, kind of notwithstanding the issues around the sort of scale issues of that, but that's kind of what it is. So you can enact these things in your daily life. The big one is the climate change thing. I mean, I read a stat somewhere that a 1 hour private jet flight produces the same amount of CO2 as the average person does in 6 months, just sort of living normally. And you see things like that, and you just think, oh, well, what's the point? And what difference can I make? And that's a perfectly understandable sort of solution. But I think what that reaction does is it cuts off the fact that you are one person in a whole collective. So if you do something, you buy an electric car, or you put some solar panels, or do whatever you do, or go on a Extinction Rebellion march, or whatever it is, it's not just you doing that. It has effects. You might not see it, and it might be latent. It might not happen in the now. It might not happen in that place. But you do have an effect. And so the more that we can do that, the people power will overtake, the people that fly their private jets. So I think that, we have to understand that that the world is made up of individual activities all combined together. So we have to change the way that we act and be in this world if we're going to, halt climate change. So I think that, we can do all sorts of things. And the book is littered with examples of what we can do and different ways of living our lives. So it's a really good point.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I love the book so much, because like I'm a person with a tendency of like doing systems view, which at times can be like paralyzing or even depressing if you're looking at the systemic problem. And my like one anxiety starting the book was like, oh great, I'm gonna now like read all these things, which like maybe like I'll be sad after it. And then no, like I started to think about like a lot of things on a personal level, and the book talks about a lot of examples, and I started to like reflect on some things we do at Sour. So in that sense, it felt very hopeful, and I want to highlight that because your point, like what we do resonates and does have effect on others. And yes, maybe we can't, like as an individual who is not a billionaire, might have like a certain level of impact that that person might have in the world, but one is greater than zero. And if this becomes, if we want to talk about numbers, right, and if this becomes like a
Yeah,
collective one greater than zero, then it has a huge
exactly.
impact.
And us in the West and in the global North, we have a disproportionate impact on the world than people in the global South. And so, the book is, I guess aimed at that audience more, the Anglophone audience, I guess, for want of a
Yeah.
better phrase. So there is a sort of sense that, well, actually, it's up to us. It's the disproportion. As your power and influence in the world increases, you have more of a responsibility to act. But that doesn't mean that. I mean, we in the West have, like I say, disproportionate effects. So we still have a responsibility as relatively small in comparison to Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, but we still have a responsibility. And so that is an important point to make, I think.
Yeah, I love that. And that ties a little bit into the last part I want to discuss. A piece of advice to anyone who wants to make progress in, I guess, like in being creative or any other thing in the world.
I mean, it's a really difficult question to answer because I think that there's so many different ways you can do it. Listen, I think that I've been asked this before, particularly about sort of younger people, and my gut response is always to sort of maintain collectives. So to understand that your individuality comes in a relationship with the collective, and so it is to sort of to understand that there is power in the collective. That the sum is always greater than so the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. And by getting together with your friends, your neighbors, your communities, your family, you're always going to be able to affect change better. So whether that means, so for example, I was giving a talk to some master's graduates who were looking to start in the creative industries, right? They were all sort of budding musicians or writers and artists, and they were all sort of pleading, so how do we not become part of the machine? And my response is, well, maintain collectives. If form sort of unions or collectives or cooperatives, because the precariousness and the exploitation happens when one person sort of undercuts someone else. So if you've got a commissioner who says, oh well, I need this graphic design done, can you do it for free, please? If some person says, oh no, I don't particularly want to do it for free, but if I don't, I'll get a job. If I don't say yes, then it'll go somewhere else. If you then go to that, if you have a collective and you say, actually, no, we're not going to do it for free, I want you to pay me. And if you ask this person and this person and this person and this person, they're all going to say the same thing, because we have formed a collective and we've all agreed that we are going to sort of say, no, we're not going to do it for free. And so that sort of thing. So when I say collective, I mean collective power, collective action. There's a wonderful video that I've seen, which probably doesn't really work on a podcast, but it's of AOC, the Cortez,
Yeah.
He's in a room and people are sort of heckling her. I forget what it was. I think it's about sort of, you're not thinking about the white working class or something. And she does a thing, says, look, the fight is here. And she sort of wags her finger up and down. It's not here. And she wags her finger between herself and the people. So the fight is not here, it's here. And I think that to me is great, and I think that sums it up. You have to know who your colleagues are, to know who your sort of comrades are, and use that power upwards. And I think that is the advice I give to people, because without collectives, you're just going to get picked apart, and the divide and conquer will happen. So it's about understanding the power that you have as a collective, however that manifests itself in your life.
I love this, and I feel like it is something that I hope anyone in field of architecture, product design, graphic design, whatever creative field could hear. And it is also so much more meaningful than just saying collaborate with others, because this is collaboration in the end too, but you're also collaborating to make sure you're protecting certain things, and also not being part of, I guess, the machine, right? So I love it, and I'm sure like we have like people in the team could be like, oh, like wish somebody told me that when I was in college.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, this was so amazing, Ollie. Thank you so much. It was such a treat. Any
Thank you.
upcoming books or anything that we should be looking out for?
So the next book I'm currently writing, although it's slow progress, is called Post-Capitalist Cities. So it's kind of going slightly back to my urban roots. I'm an urban geographer really by training, I guess. That will hopefully be out end of next year. Where are we now? 2022. Yeah. So I just need to finish it off. But I suspect I'm probably not going to finish that now till before Christmas. So, but it's basically again, I've got a sort of one of these silly or funky kind of subtitles. There's like a down and out urbanism. So rather than up and in, sort of down and out. So thinking about how we can create kind of those kind of cities along those kinds of lines, like collective common kinds of environment, because we're seeing so much of it around. I was in Manchester in the UK not that long ago, last week actually. There was some amazing kind of commune sort of places, people squatting on land and squatting on kind of old parkland and stuff. And yeah, just the sort of things they're creating and the kinds of infrastructures they've got are just, well, they're very creative, right? They're very different. They're very new. But at the same time quite old, because they're kind of they feel quite traditional and with nature. So there's a sort of, so anyway, so I'm looking at that. So it will kind of be trying to be I guess if I'm thinking about it as a linear thing, thinking about how those ethics, if you like, perhaps could be transposed to sort of on the urban environment, and thinking more about how we can create sort of better common cities. So yeah, going back to my urban roots for a bit, because I feel I've neglected them for a little bit.
I love it. And I also love like books kind of like shape up in like series almost. I feel like all of them are connected to each other. So
I think it's because like we all sort of, I mean, we have a particular drum to beat, so it kind of it ends up coming through in like, you know, a book length. Well, the length of a book, it doesn't give you a huge amount of time to sort of well, no, hang on, no. What I mean is you end up sort of saying the same things, because I don't have that much stuff to say in like 100,000 words. So it all ends up kind of saying, oh, actually, that's... So yeah, they'll have a bit of a series, but it will be kind of...
but they're all like so intertwined, and it's good to do, I feel like, a deep dive into some perspectives of it or some potential applications of it in like different contexts. So we will be on the lookout for it for sure. And
okay, great.
Yeah, and hope to see many more.
Thank you very much. Well, that's the plan. So we'll see how we go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ollie. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.